Andrew Morlet. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon. All right, thank you. Thanks very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here with you all and to have the opportunity to talk to you a bit about the circular economy and what the Foundation does. What I want to do is to firstly just give you a bit of background on the Foundation and where it's come from. Some of you may well know what we do and have heard quite a lot about the circular economy, but I would like to give you our perspective on this. To recap on some of the research that we've done over the past few years and some of the findings that we've generated, and also to share with you some very recent findings that we have just come to from a research piece that we've been working on for over the last 6 months, and we're actually launching a major report next week in Brussels to coincide with the EU Commission's opening up of consultation and their perspective on the EU circular economy package. So I wanted to preview some of the findings from that. So this will be the first time we've brought them out publicly. We literally are drying the ink on the report as I speak, and hopefully you'll find some of these new perspectives interesting. Whoop, not working. I need some slides, please. So for those of you who are not aware who Ellen MacArthur is, Ellen was previously a professional yachtswoman, and she became the fastest first person ever to sail around the world single-handed in 2010 when she did that in 71 days, 14 hours, 18 minutes and 33 seconds. Every second counted on this challenge. She did it on this yacht, which was 75 foot long and 60 foot wide. To give you a sense of the scale, Ellen could climb from the bottom of the mast to the top of the mast, inside the mast. And to give you a sense of the nature of the challenge, she was at times 2,500 miles from the nearest land, and the astronauts on the European Space Station were closer to her than the nearest human by a factor of 4 or 5 times. While on the challenge, she developed a really acute sense of the meaning of finite. When you do a challenge like this, you have to take with you all of the things you need for the race, but only just enough so that you're light enough to be competitive. So they're very, very focused on the materials that go on the boat. And she was very, very focused on the resources that she had, and it gave her this sense of the meaning of finite, and the meaning of having what she had was all she had, and she had to manage it to the very last piece of food and the very last drop of diesel until she got back to shore and completed the challenge. When she did get back to shore, what she wanted to do was to actually understand that concept of finite more broadly and to apply it to the global economy, recognising that we here in the global economy have a set of finite resources, and we need to manage these in a way that allows us to extract the value from them and to have them last in perpetuity. So she set off to understand the various models of sustainability, new schools of thought and schools of thought that have been around for some time. And she established the Foundation in 2010 with the intention of promoting the notion of a circular economy and to actively working to the acceleration of its adoption. So the mission of the Foundation is to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. One of the first things that she did was to form an integrated view of many schools of thought into a framework which she referred to as a circular economy. She engaged with McKinsey & Company to put some analytics around this to quantify the actual value of the idea, and I'll talk a bit about this. And then she went out to engage with businesses and to engage with the World Economic Forum and other bodies to popularise the idea in the marketplace and to build momentum behind it. So what is the circular economy? A good way to think about it is to reflect on today's economy, which is essentially linear by nature. We take materials out of the ground, or we extract natural resources, we make them into products which we keep for a very short period of time, we use them for a very short period of time, and then we dispose of them. And this notion of a take, make and dispose economy is really what is what we see around us in almost every aspect of the economy that we operate in today. The implications of this is that for every new product that we make, we need to use new raw materials primarily, and that's what we do. We try to recycle at the end of a product's usefulness, or at the end of its life, as many people say. But we do that at the end of pipe. We do it as an afterthought, and we do it with products that were never designed to be reused or to be recycled. So as a result, there are many challenges in actually getting and extracting value end of pipe. And also, as a result of a linear economy, waste is chronically high, and it's chronically high at the end of pipe, but it's also chronically high structurally as well, and I'll give you some indication of this. If you look at the fast-moving consumer goods sector, or the FMCG sector, as we refer to it as, if you look at this one alone, 84% of the material inputs are lost to landfill or incineration on an annual basis. So that means for these fast consumer goods, so these are products typically that you would find in a supermarket or in a store, we sometimes refer to them as products on shelves in packets. They turn over very quickly. The material inputs into that sector is about $3.2 trillion per year annually, of which $2.7 trillion of that value goes to incineration or waste landfill every single year. But the waste is more fundamental than that. It's systemic. It's structural. It's within the sectors, within the economy at large. And if we think of a few of the key sectors and look at examples, if we think about mobility and car use as one example, this in Europe, the ownership of a car represents about 15% of the average European household's expenditure. But a car is parked about 92% of the time. It's often parked on valuable inner city land. When it is used, only 1.5 of the seats in a car that has 5 seats are typically occupied. 20% of the total petroleum energy that goes into a car actually is translated into kinetic energy, and only 1/13 of that energy is used actually to transport people. So there is a tremendous amount of waste, as you can see. 50% of inner city land is dedicated or devoted to mobility. So this is roads and parking spaces. But even at rush hour, cars only cover about 10% of the average European road. So the structural waste in that sector is very large. If we think about the food systems that we have industrially, 31% of European food goes to waste along the value chain to date. Categories like fruit and vegetable lose as much as 45% of their value in terms of edible mass. Only 5% of fertilisers that are used actually go to nutrients absorbed by humans. 40% of water for irrigation, only 40% of water that goes to irrigation actually reaches plants themselves. And we have incredible rate of soil degradation. 30 to 85% of European agricultural land is currently being degraded. So these numbers represent an industrial system that has a tremendous amount of waste in it. If you think of industrial agricultural systems, they have largely become completely linear. We grow plants and food in industrial systems, we ship those to cities, we consume them, and then essentially the nutrient value of those products are entirely lost from the system. So nothing at all in that system is essentially going back to the farm. If you think about the built environment, the other third big sector, only 10 to 15% of building materials, 10 to 15% of building materials are actually wasted in the construction phase. Around 30% of municipal solid waste is actually made up of construction and demolition waste. And if you think of the occupancy levels, only 60% of offices are actually idle at any point during a working day. So there is a lot of idle capacity and structural waste. Now these three sectors actually represent around about 60% of the European household expenditure. They represent around about 80% of the material flows through the European economy. So you can see both at the end of pipe, post-consumption, and in the use phase of materials in the economy, the wastage levels are chronically high. At the same time, we have 3 billion new middle-class consumers set to enter the economy by 2030. And we have an increasing number of materials that are becoming scarce or at risk. And for Europe, there is an incredible dependency on the importation of resources. 50% more dependency in Europe than in the US, for example. And 20 of the materials shown on this list are actually already on the EU critical list of materials for the future. We see from a pricing perspective that we've had 100 years of price declines in commodity prices effectively erased in the last 10 years. And even though oil prices have come back significantly, there is more volatility in prices today than we have ever had historically in the economy before. So there are a number of significant challenges that are facing the economy, which is currently very wasteful. So a circular economy, by comparison, is one that we would refer to as regenerative and restorative by design. And it is, as I mentioned, it's an aggregation or an attempt to bring together a number of different schools of thought into a coherent framework, or an integrated framework rather. And I'm honoured to be here today with Walter, who's one of the big thinkers behind many of the concepts that we work on at the Foundation. The other areas are Cradle to Cradle, and Janine Benyus and biomimicry, and natural capitalism, and Thomas Gradle with industrial ecology. There is nothing that we claim is new thinking in terms of the schools of thought in the circular economy. All we've done is sort of bring it together into this in this integrated view, and we've emphasised the economic perspective on the topic as the lens at which we come at this. And what we define the circular economy as, really at the heart, is it's about keeping products, components and materials at their highest utility or use and value at all times. And also the notion of eliminating the concept of waste, so that materials are able to re-enter the economy at the end of use as defined, valuable, technical or biological nutrients. And some of you may have recognised this diagram here, this illustration. We often refer to it as the butterfly diagram. And you can see on the right-hand side, we have, in fact, two spheres. We have a technical sphere and a biological sphere. And within those spheres, if you think of the technical one in the first instance, we have a series of different loops. And the innermost loops are where we keep products in production longer. So we design products to be long-lived, to be repairable and upgradable, to be able to be cascaded or sold on after somebody has finished using them. We think of concepts such as the sharing economy and the second loop out, where you're able to utilise that idle capacity. So imagine Airbnb or Uber or the very many number of sharing economy ideas that are out there and models that are out there. Remanufacturing is a very important part, the third loop out, and the fourth loop out being recycling at the end of use. And recycling in this model is a very important part, but it's actually the lowest value part of the system. So ultimately we want to keep materials to be as close to what they were originally designed to be and in use for as long as possible. On the left-hand side of the diagram, we have the biological sphere, and in this sphere we're seeking to return nutrients to the cycles, so try to reconnect nutrient loops, but we also want to cascade materials and to keep them at their highest value for as long as possible. So we may cascade clothing down to something such as a wipe or a stuffing, and ultimately an insulation before it then becomes perhaps recovered if it's biological and turned back into a fibre that can be used again. We want to look at systems for extracting chemicals and chemical nutrients, extracting energy, but again keeping as far as possible the material value of these products as high as we can for as long as possible. The concepts here, and I'm sure Walter will talk more about this, is on the right-hand side, the technical sphere, we move away from the notion of a customer being a consumer and more becoming one of a user. So the notion of using materials rather than using them up and wasting them is a very important part of the right-hand side of the diagram. The other thing that we underpin this with is the notion of shifting to renewables. So at its heart, the circular economy is about moving from a system of extraction and consumption to one of using, restoring, regenerating, and to underpin all of that with renewable energy. And we can demonstrate now through the recent work that we've done that there's a very strong linkage between the keeping of materials at higher value and our ability to not only decouple material inputs, but also to lower the energy demand of the system and to lower the carbon impact. So I mentioned that we work in the area of research and insights. In 2010, when we started the foundation, as I said, we engaged with McKinsey as a knowledge partner. We produced the first report on the left there, looking at the economic opportunity that exists within medium-lived complex goods, so durable goods that last for longer than 2 years and less than 10 typically. And we wanted to quantify the levers that I've mentioned on the butterfly diagram and try to understand what this meant for company profitability, what it meant for decoupling of material imports, what it meant for the economy at large. We did that again in 2013 with the report that's in blue there, the second report looking at fast-moving consumer goods globally. So the first one was looking at Europe, medium-lived complex goods, the second one, fast-moving consumer goods globally. And we brought both of these studies back to the World Economic Forum, and we actually managed to generate a lot of interest from CEOs and the like, so much so that the World Economic Forum then wanted to partner with us and did the third report together, looking at what this meant when it was applied across global supply chains. What we found from the first two reports was really very interesting, that actually the material substitution value, the decoupling of the need for new raw materials, if we valued that alone in the medium-lived complex goods sector, that had a value of $630 billion a year for the European economy. When we looked at the fast-moving consumer goods sector, this had a value of $706 billion. So in combination, we had quantified the opportunity of more than $1 trillion a year through the application of these types of approaches. Now, fast forward to where we are today. As I mentioned, we have just been undertaking a more comprehensive study, which we're launching on the 25th of June in Brussels, and it's referred to as Growth Within, the Circular Economy Vision for a Competitive Europe. And what we wanted to do was extend the type of analysis that we've been doing to look more into this issue of structural waste and the opportunity that represents for the economy, to start to understand in more detail what the emerging technologies that we see in the market and which will play out over the next 5 years, we wanted to keep it fairly close, what the potential opportunity of those meant for the circular economy. What were the potential rebound effects as we lower the price of access? Do we get an upswell of demand that somewhat negates the benefits in terms of for example, carbon load or other issues? We wanted to understand the extent of utility in decoupling and how much that would be achieved. Look at, again, at profitability, look at GDP, but also this time around look at employment and say what would the impact of applying these models be for employment. And then importantly, what would be the impact on environment and economic resilience. And we undertook this and we looked at the three segments, the mobility, built environment and food systems. We undertook it with a number of different academic institutions, the IZA Institute in Bonn, the University of Oldenburg, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Applied Science in Augsburg, the Centre for European Economic Research, and we had 150 panel members of leading figures in companies and experts who would review and provide input into this work as we developed it. We underpinned it as well with a very strong emphasis on economic modelling so that we could actually put the numbers forward credibly with strong academic support behind it. So, as I mentioned, these three sectors represent a very significant part of the European economy. And just before I jump to the results, I mentioned as well that we're presenting this on the 25th, but we have actually shared the initial findings with Franz Timmermans, the first Vice President, Jiri Katainen, the Vice President, Commissioner Bienkowska, and Commissioner Carmen Nouvella. And we have a strong degree of interest in the findings of this report, and as such, at the Commission's event on the 25th, we're actually on the stage and we'll be launching this report as part of an input to the considerations going forward. The way in which we looked at the levers was very structured as well. The levers that that companies can exercise to capture value in a circular economic way, and we adopted a framework and referred to it now as the Resolve framework. And you can see there are a number of different levers in terms of restoring energy and shifting to renewable energy and materials, restoring the health of ecosystems, the notion of sharing economy I talked about, optimising across the value chain and within company systems to reduce waste, application of things like remanufacturing, recycling, virtualizing, so shifting to virtual services rather than products themselves, and exploring opportunities for applying service models rather than product ownership. Again, Walter will talk more about that, I'm sure, as well. But this framework allowed us then to do the analysis within each one of those levers for each one of the sectors I referred to. And what we're able to demonstrate is that for mobility, the cost reduction that can be achieved, so the first lens is the economic view in terms of cost reduction, 60 to 80% reduction in cost of mobility looking forward to 2030, and sorry, this is potential to 2050. We did two blocks, 2030, 2050, and you can see here that the cost reductions are substantial. So mobility cost reduction 60 to 80%, food reduction in terms of the cost of the system 30 to 50%, built environment 25 to 35%, so big reductions. We also looked at the impact of rebound effects, and we wanted to understand the extent to which the rebound effects would negate some of the positive benefits of this approach. And we also wanted to look at some of the potential barriers to adoption, and looking at the issue of innovation on the one hand, moving at a pace, but governmental and infrastructure systems, so governmental regulatory and infrastructure systems moving much slower, and whether that would have a substantial effect. And we know that these need to be looked at very closely. We now have a much more comprehensive understanding of the level of impact of potential rebound and the ways in which that could be managed going forward by choice. We looked at a number of different areas of impact, and we modelled the progression of the economy in two ways. One was an as-is forward view, and taking into account the initiatives that we see in the market at the moment for things like greenhouse gas reduction, regulatory objectives, governmental objectives in Europe. So that's shown on the left-hand side in the light blue. That's the projection forward of the current model. And then on the right-hand side in the darker blue would be the impact of applying the levers that I showed you in the sectors that I've talked about as well. And what you can see here is really very consistently that the adoption of a circular economy has a positive impact across many of the key dimensions that we're interested in societally in Europe. So things such as the disposable income, increases in GDP, the direct cash out and costs reductions, societal costs related to the externalities that are impacted, CO2 emissions, and primary material consumption. So if you just look at CO2 alone, what we've been able to demonstrate through this quite comprehensive modelling is that in the three sectors that we've studied, we would be able to drop CO2 by as much as 48% by 2030 across the entire economy, and by 83% by 2050. So the numbers are really quite staggering, and for the first time we're now able to make a direct linkage between carbon and materials. So in many forums and many discussions we hear about the water, food and energy nexus. I think what we're looking at here is the need to add into the discussion the material flows nexus as an extremely important part of the equation. And what does it mean overall? By 2030, shifting towards a circular economy, dematerialised model, as I've shown in the levers, could in fact generate benefits to the European society of 1.8 billion euros per annum, which actually accounts to around about 7% growth in GDP, and also with positive economic employment effects. What I haven't shown you here is the analysis that we did on employment. We've done the largest meta-analysis of circular economic related employment research in the market, and again, to add to the ones that I have shown you, we can demonstrate a positive impact on employment as well. So here is an economic model that is restorative, regenerative by design, that has a raft of now demonstrable positive impacts as byproducts of its application. And it raises a number of really very interesting questions for companies who are operating this space, as it does for government and regulators who really need to understand the implications of this direction from a regulatory perspective, and to be able to not only regulate appropriately to enable markets and to remove barriers, but also to explore the opportunities for public-private innovation initiatives that will help stimulate and progress towards this model over time. So we show in the report a number of areas that company leaders should be examining, and we also talk about the governmental implications and considerations as well. But further than that, further to that, we have over the last 6 months in parallel been working on an initiative called the Enabling Toolkit, a toolkit for circular policy, a toolkit for policymakers in the circular economy space. This again was a research piece that we ran in conjunction with the NERA Consulting and McKinsey. We collaborated with the Danish government as a pilot market for this, and we essentially built an approach, a systematic approach for regulators to be able to analyse the sectors, understand the opportunities within those sectors of applying circular economy, understand the barriers, and understand the regulatory enablers that they can act on. This report and toolkit actually gets launched on the 26th of June, so the day after next week, and we are launching it jointly with the Danish government, and we're now taking this report out and the methodology out to provide a more generic approach that can be applied in different governmental settings, so that you've got something that is actively usable in different archetypes and contexts. So that's a quick flyover of what we have been doing most recently, and I just wanted to give you a sense of what the Foundation does more broadly, quickly. I've talked about the top line there, the insights and analysis area. The report in the middle there is a report that we put out recently as well, which is called the Circularity Indicators. This is a toolkit for businesses to be able to measure products and to assess supply chains in terms of their circularity. We also, though, in the second line down, look at business and governmental innovation platforms. So we run an initiative called the C100, where we bring together governments and governmental bodies and cities, plus companies, plus university academics, plus emerging innovators. We're launching, we have a global C100 program at the moment, which we launched 2 years ago, and we have fully populated that with a number of the world's leading companies in place, with cities like Haarlemmermeer from Amsterdam, governmental bodies like Denmark, Scotland, Catalonia, the City of London, and New York is coming in as well. And this again provides that vehicle for helping regulators understand the opportunities and implications, and to provide a potential space for innovation. We're launching in Brazil later this year, and also in America. So those platforms, the satellite platforms, are starting to gain in popularity and be picked up. We also work in two other areas, education and training. We do education and training and also in comms and publications. Let me just show you a bit about those. Excuse me. A bit about those. I'll skip through some of this I've talked about. The education programs we run are structured both formal and informal, so we have a postgraduate fellowship program with a number of the world's leading universities in design, engineering and business. We have 15 universities, 14 of them are set each year, and the 15th place is a competitive place. We also work with pioneer universities. These are universities that have established research and teaching programs. And then we have an informal education program which is based on a massive open online course. And what we're trying to do here is to promote the notion of circular economy very widely globally. A massive open online course on the internet, available to everybody, multilingual. We run it for 1 month. Last year we ran it in October for the first year. We had over 70,000 unique visitors to the event in that first year. We had 250 hours of content generated. We had a lot of structured pieces that we did with headline acts and big tents where companies and universities created topics. We had foundations participate as well. We also had a lot of opportunity for anybody to participate here, so we were trying to flush out emerging innovators globally and other ideas around this space that we could then start to shine a light on. So this was a very, we feel, a very innovative approach to building interest in the education space that complements the formal education work that we do. We do other work in schools as well, which I won't touch on. But just finally, in the publication space, there's a copy of The New Dynamic, which is a book we put out last year. It's a compendium MBA reader that we can use in the education context. And on the right-hand side, we have a new book that's just coming out next week as well, written by Ken Webster on the wealth of flows. And it's trying to provide a broader landscape view of the opportunity in the circular economy and what it means potentially for society going forward. And finally, we have again, we are seeking to get as much leverage and use as many of our contemporary communication channels as possible. So we have an online news network called Circulate News, which we have a number of people contributing to. We launched it very recently and it's taken off and has a huge amount of interest already. So just in closing, I just want to reiterate that the circular economy, from our perspective, represents a huge economic and innovation opportunity. This is not about reductive sustainability. This is about creating an economy that can work in the long run, that is regenerative and restorative by design, and shifting to renewable energy as its energy source. And we've seen disruptors, many disruptors, enter the market already in this space, and they're proving to be very successful. So the Airbnbs, the Ubers, the sharing economy is one very good example. But we have a number of others in the business-to-business space which are perhaps less well known. We've got a lot of innovation occurring in the material sciences areas. We've got a lot of companies now that are starting to look at this notion of shifting from selling products to selling services, and also looking to think about their product design from an end-of-use perspective. So how will I ensure that the packaging that I use for my product actually has value at the end of use and can be recovered and reprocessed and re-enter the economy? So this is an exciting new frontier, we believe. We believe it holds huge potential for new forms of growth that are restorative and regenerative, as I mentioned. And importantly, the model actually protects stocks of valuable natural resources and focuses much more on the valorization of flows of materials rather than the extractive and consumptive use of stocks. So in simple terms, we're really promoting within the circular economy a model that allows people to innovate and to grow, but by doing that through using things rather than just using them up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew Morlet, just a question from my side. I mean, if I look at this, it all sounds so perfect. It sounds like there's no argument against it. But I'm sure there's some obstacles. Where do you sort of find them, or where do you see them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, what's been interesting is that this idea has really accelerated in the last few years. I mean, it came, as I mentioned, it came out of nowhere 4 years ago, and what we have seen is a huge amount of traction in attracting companies to this idea who are recognising that this is an important way of decoupling their business from material scarcity and from the volatility of material prices. And they're starting to innovate in that space. But it's not without its challenges, because these ideas compete with linear economic ideas that have a tremendous amount of momentum, and we refer to that as there's a linear lock-in that we have in companies and in organisations. The disruptors play an important role because they stimulate companies to actually start to look at new possibilities, and companies are trying to understand how they can disrupt themselves and get to this space. So that's one set. There's another set of regulatory barriers that exist, and there are, as we mentioned, in any of the sectors that we look at, there are existing regulations that actively work against the notion of circularity.
Because they're behind it? I mean,
well, it could be the definition of waste, which prevents the movement of materials across borders to be able to aggregate, to be able to get critical mass of economics. It could be around taxation systems and the like that incentivise linear economics. There are a number of structural regulatory issues that at the moment present somewhat of a barrier. But I think that we're seeing this play out at the moment in Europe, and a tremendous amount of momentum behind it and interest in exploring it. And the event that I mentioned on the 25th, the 400 seats at that event sold out in 2 hours. So they doubled it to 800 and sold out in the next 2 hours, and they can't clear the waiting list. So there's a lot of interest in actually trying to find ways of getting over some of those barriers.
And we're very proud that we here in Switzerland got to hear it first, before you launched it in Brussels.
Very good.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.